My son looked me straight in the eye in front of his wife, his in-laws, and our entire extended family and said, "Mom, don't plan your future around me." Everyone at that table went silent. I felt my face burn hot with humiliation. This was the boy I raised alone after his father died, the boy I worked 2 jobs for, the boy whose college tuition I paid by selling my wedding ring. And now, at 63 years old, sitting at a restaurant table surrounded by people who were supposed to love me, I was being told out loud that I didn't matter to his future. I smiled. I nodded. I said, "Of course, honey." But inside, something cold and final clicked into place. By noon that same day, I was sitting in a lawyer's office. And what I did next changed everything. Stay with me, because if you've ever given everything to someone who made you feel small in return, you need to hear how this story ends. Subscribe now, because trust me, the ending is worth it. My name is Diane Foster, and I live in a quiet suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, in a house that used to be full of noise and now is full of silence. I want to tell you this story the way it actually happened, not the polished version, not the version where I come out looking like a saint, but the real one, because I think a lot of you will recognize pieces of yourselves in it. I married my husband, Richard, when I was 22 years old. He was a quiet man, an electrician, steady and kind, the kind of man who fixed things without being asked and never once raised his voice at me in 18 years of marriage. We had one son together, Trevor, born in the spring of 1990, and I remember holding him in the hospital and thinking that my whole life finally made sense. Richard died. When Trevor was 11, a heart attack, sudden, no warning. One Tuesday morning, he was drinking his coffee and reading the newspaper, and by that evening, I was a widow with an 11-year-old boy and a mortgage I didn't know how we'd pay. I won't pretend those years were easy, because they weren't. I taught 3rd grade during the day, and I cleaned offices 2 nights a week just to keep the lights on. I sold nearly every piece of jewelry I owned, including the wedding ring Richard gave me when Trevor got into Ohio State and the financial aid didn't cover everything. I told myself it didn't matter, that things are just things, that my son's future was worth more than a ring sitting in a drawer. I never once complained to him about any of it. I wanted him to grow up feeling secure, feeling loved, feeling like he never had to worry about money the way I did. Maybe that was my first mistake, because a child who never sees the sacrifice sometimes grows up believing everything was simply owed to him. Trevor graduated, got a good job in finance, and a few years later he married a woman named Kimberly. I liked Kimberly at first, or at least I tried to. She was polished, ambitious, the kind of woman who always had her makeup perfect and her opinions ready. I told myself that different didn't mean bad, and for the wedding I gave them $15,000, nearly every cent I'd managed to save, as a gift toward their first home. I didn't ask for anything in return. I just wanted to see my son happy and settled. For the first few years of their marriage, things were fine, or at least fine enough that I didn't see what was coming. I babysat their daughter, my granddaughter, Ellie, almost every week without ever being asked to be paid, because what grandmother charges her own family? I drove 40 minutes each way, twice a week, sometimes 3 times, rearranging my own retirement schedule around their convenience. I brought groceries when their fridge was empty and never mentioned it again. I sewed Ellie's Halloween costume by hand 2 years in a row because Kimberly said the store-bought ones were tacky. Slowly, though, I started noticing things. Small things at first, the kind of things you talk yourself out of because you don't want to believe your own family could be unkind. Kimberly would correct the way I dressed Ellie, the way I fed her, the way I spoke to her, in a tone that made it clear she thought I was somehow beneath the standard she expected. At a birthday party, I overheard her telling her sister that I was a little much, that I hovered. that she wished Trevor's mother had more of a life of her own. I stood in that kitchen holding a tray of cupcakes I'd baked from scratch, and I felt my whole body go still. I didn't say anything. I put the tray down, smiled, and walked back out to the party like I hadn't heard a word. That's the thing about being a mother who sacrifices everything. You learn to swallow a lot of pain quietly because you don't want to be the difficult one. You don't want to cause a scene. You don't want to lose the only family you have left. Trevor never defended me in these moments, not once. If I ever gently mentioned that something Kimberly said had stung, he'd sigh and say, "Mom, don't make this a thing," or "You're too sensitive," as if my feelings were an inconvenience he had to manage rather than something that mattered. I told myself he was just trying to keep the peace in his marriage. I told myself that's what good husbands do. I didn't yet understand that keeping the peace in that house always meant me swallowing the insult. The years went on like that, small cuts that never quite healed before the next one came. When Ellie started school, I was suddenly too available, which somehow became a criticism. Instead of a compliment, Kimberly began scheduling family events and simply forgetting to tell me, then acting surprised when I asked why I hadn't been invited. I missed Ellie's first dance recital because nobody thought to mention the date had changed. I found out about it from a photo on Facebook 3 days later, my own granddaughter twirling, in a purple costume I had never even seen in person. I called Trevor, hurt, trying to keep my voice steady, and he said, "Mom, it's not that deep. There'll be other recitals." There weren't many more. Not for me, anyway. Around this time, I started thinking seriously about retirement. I was 61, exhausted. My knees ached from decades of standing in front of a classroom, and I began meeting with a financial advisor to figure out what my future actually looked like. I owned my house outright, paid off after 30 years, the one Richard and I bought when Trevor was a baby. I had a modest pension, some savings, and I'll admit, in the back of my mind, I always assumed that one day everything I had would go to Trevor and Ellie. Why wouldn't it? He was my only child. I had given him everything I had, quite literally, for over 3 decades. I started to think about downsizing, about maybe moving somewhere smaller, warmer, closer to Trevor's family so I could be more present for Ellie as she grew up. I even looked at a little condo 15 minutes from their house, thinking how wonderful it would be to walk to Ellie's soccer games, to be woven back into their daily life instead of standing on the outside of it. I brought it up at a family lunch, the one that changed everything. It was a Sunday in early June, and Kimberly's parents were visiting from out of town, so we were all gathered at a nice restaurant. Downtown, the kind of place with white tablecloths and a wine list. Kimberly's choice. Always Kimberly's choice. I was nervous. In a good way. The way you get when you're about to share something hopeful. I waited until dessert, when everyone was relaxed, and the conversation had a natural lull, and I said gently, "I've been thinking about moving closer to you all. There's a sweet little condo not far from here, and I thought it might be nice to be more a part of everyday life, especially with Ellie growing up so fast." I remember smiling as I said it. I remember genuinely believing this would make everyone happy. Kimberly's mother raised her eyebrows and glanced at her daughter. Kimberly set down her wine glass a little too firmly, the sound sharper than it needed to be, and there was a pause that stretched just a beat too long. Then Trevor, my son, the boy I raised alone, the boy whose entire education I paid for by selling the ring off my own finger, looked at me across that white tablecloth in front of his in-laws, in front of the waiter refilling our water glasses, and said the words I will never forget as long as I live. "Mom, don't plan your future around me. I have my own life now." The table went quiet. Kimberly's father cleared his throat and suddenly became very interested in his coffee cup. I felt heat crawl up my neck and into my face, that specific, humiliating heat of being shamed in public by the person you love most in the world. I looked at Trevor, waiting for him to soften it, to say he didn't mean it that way, to laugh it off as a joke gone wrong. He didn't. He just picked up his fork and kept eating his cheesecake, as if he hadn't just detonated something inside his own mother. Kimberly gave a small, satisfied smile, the kind of smile you give when you've been waiting a long time to hear someone else say the thing you've been thinking. "I just think it's healthy," she added, "for everyone to have their own boundaries." Boundaries. As if I had ever once shown up uninvited, as if I had ever asked them for a single dollar in return for everything I'd given, as if wanting to be close to my only granddaughter in the last decades of my life was some kind of imposition to be managed. I smiled, because that's what I'd trained myself to do for years by that point. I said, "Of course, honey, I understand." I finished my coffee. I made small talk about Kimberly's parents' flight home. I hugged everyone goodbye in the Chia parking lot, even Kimberly, even though my hands were trembling. And then I got in my car, alone, and I sat there in the restaurant parking lot for almost 20 minutes before I could make myself drive. I want to be honest with you about what that moment felt like, because I think humiliation like that doesn't hit you all at once. It hits you in waves. The first wave was shame, the specific, searing shame of being dismissed by your own child in front of strangers. The second wave was grief, because in that instant, I understood something I had been refusing to see for years, that my son did not see me as family in the way I saw him. He saw me as an obligation to be managed, a convenience when useful and an inconvenience when not. The third wave, and this is the one that surprised me, was clarity. Driving home that day, replaying his words over and over. "Don't plan your future around me," I kept thinking, funny, because I built my entire life around you. I built it around you when I sold my wedding ring. I built it around you when I worked until 11 at night, cleaning strangers' offices so you could have new shoes for school. Built it around you when I handed over $15,000 I couldn't really afford to give, so you and Kimberly could buy your first house. I built it around you every single Sunday. I drove 40 minutes each way to watch Ellie so you two could have your date nights. And now, the moment I asked for one small thing, to simply be near you, to be included, I was told not to plan my future around him. Fine. I wouldn't. That night, I didn't sleep much. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in front of me, staring at the framed photo of Richard on the wall, the one from our 20th anniversary. And I asked him, out loud, like a crazy woman, I suppose, what he would think of the man our son had become. I didn't get an answer, obviously, but something in me settled anyway. I thought about my will. I had written it years earlier, right after Richard passed, naming Trevor as my sole beneficiary, everything. The house, my savings, my modest life insurance policy, all of it. Without a second thought, because that's what mothers do, we plan for the people we love to be taken care of after we're gone. But sitting there that night, I thought about his words again. Don't plan your future around him. And I thought, if he doesn't want to be part of my future while I'm alive, then he has no place at the center of what happens to everything I've spent a lifetime building after I'm gone. This wasn't rage, not exactly, though there was plenty of that underneath. It was something quieter and more decided than rage. It was the feeling of finally putting down a weight I had been carrying for far too long. The next morning, I called an old friend of mine, Patricia, who happens to be an estate attorney, someone I've known since we were young mothers pushing strollers around the same park 30 years ago. I told her everything. the recital I missed, the years of small dismissals, and finally, the words at that restaurant table. Patricia didn't tell me I was overreacting. She didn't tell me to sleep on it. She said, "Diane, come in tomorrow morning and bring your current will." I want to pause here and say something important, because I know some people watching this might think what I did next was cruel, or petty, or vindictive. It wasn't. Everything I did from this point forward was completely legal, completely calm, and honestly, completely fair. I wasn't trying to destroy my son's life. I was simply refusing, for the first time in over 30 years, to build my future around someone who had made it painfully clear he had no interest in building his around me. By noon the next day, I was sitting across from Patricia's polished mahogany desk, my old will spread out between us. "Talk me through what you actually want," she said. And for the first time in a long while, I let myself really think about that question. What did I want? I wanted security for myself first. For years, I had planned my entire financial future around leaving as much as possible to Trevor, which meant I had been living far more frugally than I needed to, skipping small joys, delaying a trip to Italy I'd dreamed of since I was a young woman. Also, there would be more to leave behind for a son who had just told me, in front of a room full of people, that I shouldn't factor him into my plans at all. Well, if he didn't want to be part of my plans, I decided I would finally start living for myself. Patricia and I restructured everything. I converted a portion of my retirement savings into an annuity that would provide me guaranteed monthly income for the rest of my life, so I would never have to worry about running out of money in my old age, regardless of what anyone else in my family did or didn't do for me. I updated my will so that the house, when I eventually pass or choose to sell it, along with the remainder of my estate, would be split between two things that actually meant something to me. Half would go into a scholarship fund at the elementary school where I taught for over 30 years, named after Richard, for kids from single-parent households who need help affording college, the way I once desperately needed help affording Trevor's. The other half would go to my niece, Rachel, my late sister's daughter, a young woman who calls me every single Sunday just to check in, who drove 3 hours to sit with me for 2 days when I had my gallbladder surgery 2 years ago, who has never once asked me for a single thing. I removed Trevor as beneficiary entirely, not out of cruelty, out of honesty. I was simply making my will match the words he'd said to me himself. I also decided, sitting in that office, that I was done being the free, on-call grandmother whenever it was convenient for Kimberly's schedule. I loved Ellie fiercely, and nothing about that would ever change, but I would no longer show up like an employee with no boundaries of my own, only to be reminded that my presence in the family was apparently optional. I told Patricia I wanted to sell the little condo idea entirely, forget moving closer to people who didn't want me closer, and instead I wanted to finally book that trip to Italy I'd been dreaming about since I was 25 years old. She smiled and said, "Diane, I think this might be the healthiest decision you've made in years." I signed the new documents that same afternoon. I didn't call Trevor to tell him. I didn't send an angry text. I didn't post anything dramatic online. I simply went home, made myself a real dinner instead of the sad little portions I'd been rationing myself for years, and I slept better that night than I had in months. For the next several weeks, life went on quietly. I still saw Ellie, though on my terms now, a Saturday morning here and there for pancakes, a trip to the zoo, small sweet moments that belonged fully to the two of us instead of being squeezed in around Kimberly's schedule. I started taking a watercolor painting class at the community center on Tuesday evenings, something I'd wanted to do for 20 years, and never made time for. I booked my flight to Rome for the following spring, and I cried a little, happy tears when the confirmation email landed in my inbox. Trevor and I still spoke occasionally, brief, polite phone calls. The kind where neither of us mentioned the restaurant at all, as if it had never happened, though I could feel the distance between us settling into something more permanent. I didn't chase him. For the first time in his entire life, I let my son come to me instead of the other way around. And for a while, he didn't. I think he assumed everything was fine, that I'd absorbed his words the way I always absorbed everything, quietly, without consequence. He had no idea what I'd done at Patricia's office. He had no idea that the mother who had spent 30 years bending herself around his convenience had finally, quietly stopped. The truth came out about 4 months later, in a way I honestly hadn't planned or expected. Trevor and Kimberly had been talking, apparently, about their own long-term financial planning the way couples do, and at some point Kimberly asked him directly what he thought his eventual inheritance from me might look like, because they were considering a bigger house and wanted to know what kind of future money they might be able to count on. I only know this because Trevor told me himself. Weeks later, in a conversation that started calm and ended in a place I never expected. He called me on a Thursday evening, and I could hear something different in his voice right away, a kind of forced casualness. "Hey, Mom, quick question," he said. "Kimberly and I are talking to a mortgage guy about a bigger place, and I just wanted to get a general sense of, down the road, what things might look like with your estate, just for planning purposes." I sat very still for a moment, my paintbrush still in my hand from the class I'd just come home from, and I thought about lying, about softening it, about protecting him from the truth the way I'd protected him from every uncomfortable feeling, his entire life. Then I thought about that restaurant table and Kimberly's small, satisfied smile and the words, "Don't plan your future around me," and I decided, gently but honestly, to tell him the truth. "Trevor," I said, "I actually updated my will a few months ago. You're not the beneficiary anymore." There was silence on the other end of the phone, a long, heavy silence. "What?" he finally said. "Since when? Why would you do that?" "Since about noon, the day after our lunch downtown," I said quietly. "You told me not to plan my future around you." So I stopped. He was stunned into silence for a moment, and then the excuses started coming, fast and defensive, the way they always did when he felt cornered. "Mom, that's not what I meant. I meant don't move somewhere just because of us. That's totally different from this." "Is it?" I asked, and I kept my voice calm because I had promised myself I wouldn't yell, wouldn't cry, wouldn't give him the emotional reaction he was probably expecting. Because it didn't feel different sitting at that table, in front of your in-laws, being told that my future wasn't something you wanted to factor into your life. It felt very clear, actually. "So this is what, punishment?" he said, and I could hear Kimberly's voice faintly in the background, sharp, asking what was going on. "No," I said. "It's not punishment. It's honesty. I spent 30 years building my life around you, Trevor. I sold my wedding ring for your tuition. I worked nights cleaning offices so you'd never feel poor. I gave you and Kimberly $15,000 for your first house without blinking. I drove 80 miles round trip twice a week for years to help with Ellie and never once asked for gas money. And when I finally asked for one small thing, to be a bigger part of your life as I got older, you told me, in front of a table full of people, not to plan my future around you. So I listened. I stopped. He didn't have a response to that. Not right away. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I wasn't the one scrambling to fill an uncomfortable silence. Kimberly got on the phone a few minutes later, her voice tight and clipped. "Diane, I think you're being incredibly unfair. Family doesn't work like some kind of transaction where you keep score. And I have to tell you, something in me that had stayed quiet for 30 years finally spoke up, calm and clear. "You're right, Kimberly," I said. "Family shouldn't work like a transaction. So let's not pretend the last several years have been anything other than exactly that. I was invited when I was useful and dismissed when I wasn't. I was your free babysitter and your unpaid party planner, and the moment I asked to simply be closer to my own granddaughter, I was told I was too much. I'm not angry. I'm not trying to punish anyone. I'm simply done pretending that a relationship where I give everything and receive conditions in return is something I have to keep funding, literally, with my own life savings." She didn't have much to say after that. The weeks following that phone call were tense, understandably. Trevor tried a few times to walk back what he'd said at the restaurant, calling it a joke that landed wrong, calling it a misunderstanding, blown out of proportion. I listened to all of it patiently, and I told him honestly that I wasn't interested in relitigating one sentence at one lunch, because that sentence was really just the moment I finally noticed a pattern that had been building for years. I told him I still loved him, that nothing about my will changed how much he mattered to me as my son, but that I had simply stopped organizing my future, my finances, and my remaining years around the hope that one day he'd treat me the way I had always treated him. I told him the door was open if he ever wanted to actually rebuild something real, not based on money, not based on inheritance, but based on him actually showing up. Something shifted after that, slowly, in a way I hadn't expected. A few weeks later, Trevor showed up at my house unannounced on a Saturday morning, alone, without Kimberly, without Ellie, just him, standing on my porch looking about 12 years old again, the way he used to look right after his father died. He didn't come to argue about the will. He came to apologize, really apologize, the kind where you can hear a person actually meaning the words instead of just performing them. He told me he'd been thinking a lot about what I said, about the tuition, about the ring, about the years of night shifts he barely remembered because he was a child when they happened. He said Kimberly's comment about boundaries that day had made him feel like a good, modern husband, standing up for his marriage, and he hadn't stopped to think about how it would land on the mother who raised him completely alone. I made him coffee, and we sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd cried alone the night after that lunch, and we actually talked, really talked, for the first time in years. I didn't reverse my will that day, and I want to be honest with you about that, because I think it's an important part of this story. Trust isn't rebuilt in a single apology over one cup of coffee, no matter how sincere it sounds in the moment. I told him I appreciated what he said, that it meant something real to me, but that actions over time would matter more than any single conversation. Over the following year, things slowly, genuinely changed. Trevor started calling just to check in, not to ask about money, not to ask a favor, just to talk. He brought Ellie over more, on his own initiative, not because Kimberly needed a babysitter, but because he said he wanted his daughter to actually know her grandmother, not just be dropped off at her house. Kimberly and I never became close, and I've made peace with that. Some relationships simply have a ceiling, and that's all right. But she stopped making the little comments, and I stopped bending over backward to earn a place at her table. I took my trip to Italy that spring, alone, and it was one of the most beautiful, freeing experiences of my entire life. I stood in front of the Trevi fountain and I cried, not out of sadness, but because I finally understood that I was allowed to build a life that was mine, that I didn't have to earn my own future by disappearing into everyone else's. About 18 months after that lunch, I did update my will again. Not back to the original version, not entirely, because I'd learned something important about protecting myself that I refused to unlearn. I kept the scholarship fund in Richard's name exactly as it was, because that had never been about punishing Trevor. It had become something I genuinely believed in. I kept a portion for my niece Rachel, because she had earned that trust through years of quiet, consistent love, not sudden guilt-driven gestures. But I did add Trevor and Ellie back in for a share, because by then he had actually shown me through a year of consistent, patient effort that he understood what he'd done and was genuinely trying to be different. I never told him the exact details of what I changed, and I don't think I ever will, because I've learned that peace of mind matters more to me now than being owed gratitude. For every decision I make with my own money, I think about that lunch often, honestly, more than I probably should. But I don't think about it with the same shame I felt sitting in that parking lot afterward. I think about it as the moment I finally stopped auditioning for a place in my own family. I think about it as the moment I remembered that love. Real love isn't measured by how much you're willing to erase yourself for someone else's comfort. I gave Trevor my wedding ring's worth of gold, my nights, my savings, my whole 30-year-old self, and none of that giving was wasted, because I don't regret raising him with everything I had. But I finally understood something at 63 years old that I wish someone had taught me at 30. You can love someone with your whole heart and still refuse to build your entire future around a person who won't make space for you in theirs. Boundaries, real ones, aren't cruel. They're actually the most honest form of love there is, because they force everyone at the table to show up as they truly are, instead of hiding behind the comfortable assumption that you'll always give, no matter what. If you're watching this and some part of it feels a little too familiar, if you've spent years bending yourself smaller to keep the peace in your own family, I hope you hear this clearly. You are allowed to plan your future around yourself. You are allowed to stop being the safety net for people who won't even hold your hand. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do for the people you love isn't one more sacrifice. It's simply, quietly, finally choosing yourself. If this story moved you, please give it a like, subscribe for more real, emotional stories like this one, and tell me in the comments, would you have done the same thing I did? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.